Continuing You Can Change the World, the Christopher Approach by James Keller. We are starting Chapter 8, The Library. Arsenal of Ideas. In the United States, today, approximately 12,000 libraries are needed to provide the proper library service to which the American people, young and old, are entitled. According to the American Library Association, 70 million of our citizens are now either partly served or are not served at all. Looking into the future, it has been estimated that in the next 6 years, 18,000 more professional librarians and about 50,000 clerical assistants will be required to fill posts in public libraries throughout the country, to staff the libraries of colleges and universities, to administer the special libraries which serve businesses and industrial concerns, government agencies, professional groups, and institutions. But most of all, they will be needed to run the libraries in the 28,000 secondary and 225,000 elementary schools, which train millions of impressionable young Americans, the youth of today, who will be the adult citizens of tomorrow. The power of librarians to assist in this task should not be underestimated. Contrary to the belief of many, a library is no more a mere storehouse of printed volumes. It is an arsenal of ideas. It is, in fact, the very background where truth and falsehood struggle fiercely for possession of the human mind. Again, contrary to popular belief, the librarian doesn't escape from life. He or she helps to mold it for good or for evil. Any incompetence can serve as well as ill will in stunting the minds and warping the souls of those who come to the library to be remade. An otherwise good book in wrong hands, a bad book in any hands, may do tremendous damage. Principal functions of a library. The varied functions of an average library make equally varied demands on the intelligence and training of its personnel. For example, selecting and ordering books and other material is within the providence of the order department. From any standpoint, the success or failure of any library depends upon the proper selection of the printed matter which goes on its shelves. The standards of any library will be the standards of those men and women who compose the order department, since most libraries usually operate on small budgets. The book selectors are in a position of particular power for good or evil. All too often, an individual can use his or her position in the selection to purchase books that will do untold harm, and refuse to purchase books with sound values, leaving as reason for such refusal the excuse, no funds. We have been informed that in one of the leading universities of our country, which has in its possession millions of bound volumes, there exists an occasional discrimination against sound religious books, and those which contain reference to the basic principles upon which America is founded. Atheists and agnostics are able to keep from the shelves books of genuine value simply by disapproving their purchase on financial grounds. On the other hand, however, a person with a Christopher purpose who is qualified to work in this field and in this department can do much to change for the better the selection of reading material for the general public. As one West Coast librarian writes, "The head librarian here is a fine living man and quite prominent in civic affairs. Whenever I hear of books with good Christian principles, I put in an order for them, and most of the time the library buys them." It might well be to point out in this connection that libraries make it a practice to order books which seem to be in demand, a fact of which many library users are not aware. If your library does not have a copy of a particular book, you and your friends with a Christopher purpose can bring friendly pressure to bear upon the order department simply by putting in a reserve for it. Those who catalog books perform the second function of the library, that of organizing and interpreting collections after they have been purchased, so that the readers may benefit by the fact of having a wide variety of volumes accessible. The Christopher Cataloger has opportunities every day to highlight the more worthwhile material by simple technical devices. The third function of the library is to advise readers. Reference librarians who help people to locate information, have it in their power to assist in the building of a better world, are to help in the destruction of the library and free God-given rights we now possess. By person-to-person contact with readers, these librarians can shape the thinking of thousands, since people frequently recommend to their friends the books which they have been advised to read. The circulating librarian performs the fourth function of this arsenal of ideas, and has tremendous power for evil or for good. One young man still remembers that when he was in his teens, such a person advised against his selecting a certain book on psychology. Had he read that book, he admits today, much of his outlook on life might have been distorted. Circulating librarians are continually asked about reading material. Is this good? With a Christopher motive, they can easily discourage an individual from selecting a worthless volume simply by replying, "I read it, and I don't think there's very much in it." This approach is far more effective than a condemnation because, for some curious reason, many people seem to want to read books about which others are outspoken in their criticism. In this connection, some libraries have even organized special departments to prepare special courses of reading for people, such as outlines of study, programs for study clubs, group projects, and so on. The fifth function of the library is to extend its operations through branches, traveling libraries, and like facilities, especially in rural areas. Additional function of the library. Included under a general listing of all these functions, there are several additional phases of this increasingly important field, which should be mentioned briefly. First, librarians in adult education, including readers, advisors, community workers, and group leaders, perform a much-needed service since they are in close contact with the millions of adults who turn to the libraries for special services. The greatest demand for these services today exists in the fields of science, technology, and social studies. A leader in an adult education discussion group has perhaps the best chance of all to further the Christopher idea. Such a group usually meets to read and discuss outstanding books of every age, and in a wide variety of subjects. An able leader can point out what is truth and what is error, and sometimes along in the schedule will find an opportunity to show the necessity for a belief in God and in religion. Well, perhaps religion as a concept rather than any particular claim, because that's, of course, not their, what about the separation of church and state? And sometimes it's better to call people towards good and truth than towards the label. Second, institutional libraries, specifically prison and hospital libraries, offer rich fields of endeavor for the Christopher. Here the librarian must see to it that the physical institutional routine does not create institutionalized minds. He or she corrects and eliminates dangerous mental attitudes and creates good ones by judicious prescription of books. The prisoner must be made a law-abiding and useful citizen again. The hospital patient must forget fears and anxieties for the sake of the cure and regain self-reliance during recuperation. The librarian with sound principles is not only vitally important to these processes, but is strategically placed to direct the thoughts of many who, with the preoccupations of daily private life interrupted, have just begun really to think for the first time. Since World War II, the number of these positions has increased greatly. Third, there are splendid opportunities open at the moment for Army librarians. Many calls for candidates have frequently gone unfiled. With a Christopher purpose, such librarians could do a magnificent job of spreading truth by proper selection and featuring of reading material at military posts, scattered all over the world. Many librarians during the war were particularly good on personal advice and counsel, and made it a point to keep on hand appropriate books to fill the needs not ordinarily met by the regular collections of volumes allotted to them. Public relations, which actually is library advertising, offers additional chances to work with a Christopher motive. The library has a good collection of books for children. For example, it may have a special display on some sources of spiritual help in the face of the atomic threat. It may even sponsor a lecture on religion in the 20th century literature. If the public relations officer is Christopher-minded, he or she can so present this material that the spiritual concept is faithfully and convincingly brought to the attention of the reading public. Finally, because of the recent development of such new resources as motion picture films, microfilm, visual aids, sound recordings, music scores, maps, and pamphlets, there is an expanding field for those who wish to work in these new media. Libraries are relatively empty today with all the internet and whatnot, but qualifications for librarians. For those who may want to enter this field as general librarians and whose duties will be very broad: selection and ordering of books, cataloging, reader guidance, adult education, etc. The following itemized qualifications will give some index as to the type of men and women needed: interest in books and in people, business and administrative ability, pleasing personality, courteous and responsive manner, keen intelligence, quickness of perception, accuracy, tolerance, acceptability, resourcefulness, good judgment, persistence, common sense, neatness. As regards educational background, there are required 4 years of college and 1 year of library school. Emphasis while in college upon physical and social sciences, history, American and English literature, a working knowledge of French, Spanish, or German. The qualifications for, Spanish is more important than any of those three, but the qualifications for children's libraries vary somewhat from those for general librarians. To summarize them briefly, however, they should include a liking for children and young people, respect for their ideas and interests, a belief that good books should be a vital part of their lives, adaptable personality, good health. Further, they should include a knowledge of children's books and an ability to evaluate and select new volumes, a reasonable degree of proficiency in public speaking to include storytelling, oral reviewing, radio talks, and instruction in the use of library facilities. Concerning education, it is necessary to have 4 years of college plus 1 year in an accredited library school, wide experience in reading children's literature. The average number of hours worked weekly in most libraries is between 36 and 44. Annual vacations of 3 to 4 weeks are customary. In university libraries, vacations are usually 1 month, and school libraries 2 or 3 months. There are other professions with higher incomes, but for the alert and able worker, progress is comparatively rapid. The great shortage of librarians has resulted in sharp salary increases. Capable young persons have risen to responsible administrative posts within 5 to 10 years. Even so, those who wish to become guardians of these arsenals of ideas and who expect to be heavily repaid financially will stand to be disappointed. Those with the Christopher purpose, however, who wish to become librarians are willing to make sacrifices, and sacrifices some must make, if this important sphere of influence is to fulfill its democratic function. Will find that there are tremendous opportunities to do much good. To their credit, many have already realized this and done something about it. One man who received his master's degree in library science recently took a job at the bottom of the ladder in the library field, just to be able to become part of this sphere of ideas. His is a deeply spiritual motivation, and he expects to spend 8 or 10 years in varying posts until he can reach a more responsible position where his influence for good may be felt in an ever-widening circle of library users. In the meantime, he has written a small number of articles on various phases of his chosen field for the purpose of interesting others with sound ideas to become librarians. At every opportunity, he points out the danger of allowing those with erratic tendencies to take positions which can just as easily be filled by those with a deep sense of truly American principles. Not all who want to enter the library field, of course, possess the requisite academic training to qualify as full-fledged librarians. Still, they can serve a most useful purpose as sub-professionals and clerical assistants, performing a variety of library tasks in which their influence for good can be felt by those in more responsible positions. A high vocation. The librarian has a high vocation. With a new age coming to birth, it would be unfortunate indeed to close one's ears if a call to that life should come. Now, does the age of Aquarius start in the 1800s, or does it start as late as the 2400s? Somewhere in between, depends on which star diagram you're looking at, right? To one imbued with the Christopher idea, this applies especially. Such a person should experience the added realization that being a servant of the people and the capacity of librarian does not call for a person to be prejudiced or obscurantist. He or she should be mainly concerned that those who employ his or her services receive the sound nourishment and wholesome refreshment they seek in books, and that before taking what is unwholesome, they should at least be made to recognize the specious poisons which often lurk on library shelves. To fail in this task is little different from putting deadly drugs in a medicine cabinet within the reach of a child. What about all those Bayer and other ads of heroin and stuff not needing children's supervision? I'm not kidding, look it up. A pharmacist would know how to use chemicals, however deadly. What is more, he would have the right to use them. A child would not, and his parents would certainly have no right to place them within reach of his inquisitive hands. In one of the largest mental hospitals in the United States, something very much along these lines recently took place. A doctor, a subversive, got on the medical staff, and one of the first things he tried to do was to order questionable books for the hospital library. He demanded that they be bought at once. When he told he would have to take the matter up with the hospital board, he promptly set to work to bring as much pressure as possible to bear on the authorities by encouraging others of his twisted mental persuasion to apply for positions on the hospital staff. On the other hand, and on a brighter note, in one of the leading eastern cities, the chief of the children's and the young people's section of one of the metropolitan libraries has always made a point of personally and individually selecting each and every book which goes into the children's and young people's collection of some 12,000 volumes. She makes sure every single book is unobjectionable and uses great discretion in permitting any sort of questionable book to get into the hands of young people. For example, certain art books are kept on a shelf for reserved books behind her desk. If any student wants to see one of these books, she questions him or her and ascertains if the intention to use the volume is a legitimate one. Only if and when she is convinced that the latter is the case will she let the boy or girl have the material requested. Of this woman can be said what one parent wrote about a certain other librarian in her own community. I've always been impressed, the letter read, with the fact that Mrs. is not merely a custodian of books, as many librarians are, but a person who makes the students and the teachers alike aware that books, like food, have to be used wisely. The librarian's stock and trade. God's influence in every human being is nourished on truth, and truth is the librarian's stock and trade. The true librarian is the scholar's ready reference, the teacher's right hand, the bosom friend of youth, the staff for troubled parents, the guide to well-spent leisure, a beacon of truth in a twilight, stormy world. When he or she is the opposite of these things, he or she represents an active menace to everything for which our civilization stands. For example, in Washington, D.C., there are no less than 300 libraries, a fact the the godless have been well aware, offers a fertile field for their activities, since the members of Congress and other branches of government frequently have recourse to these libraries in preparing legislation or furnishing data on a variety of subjects for congressional consideration. It is not hard to imagine the harm that can be done by those who purposely provide slanted reference material to an unsuspecting applicant. The risk to readers is acute also when many of those who pass for librarians are semi-literate, but quite uneducated, tolerant but not informed. It can be a case of the blind leading the blind. One cannot safely traffic in ideas without first having a firm grasp on their history, and without making a sincere effort to see them in their true light. Even facts must be fitted into a background, nor are they always equipped to distinguish fact from fancy. When both come couched in the same terminology, as for tolerance, that cardinal virtue of undisciplined minds, one cannot be tolerant of falsehood, and likewise tolerant of truth, for to tolerate means to put up with something one may not like. No public servant, especially no sound-thinking librarian, has a right to put up with untruth or to dislike truth. You will have the Christopher idea firmly implanted in your minds, and hearts should be content that young Americans sometimes find it difficult to discover the truth they seek in our libraries. Instead, you should be concerned that our rich heritage of scholarship and genuine literature is often being overlooked in favor of much that is pagan and materialistic. Well, pagan is the Catholic word before 1967 for all monotheists, every non-Christian religion, and, these things should be known about, whether you agree with them or not. Again, that's something to be tolerant of, right? If sanity is to emerge once more, and soon, more librarians are needed who have a zeal, God-fearing grasp of the intellectual content of our civilization, who have some realization of the importance of preserving it in living minds. In America, the vast majority of our citizens read books. Well, not anymore. You who cherish truth and reverence human dignity ought to be intent that they do more with books than waste their time, becloud their imagination, and confuse their minds. And if charity be more than a meaningless word, you should dedicate yourselves to this task. Even if it involves some measure of sacrifice, there is a nobler service to humanity than the saving of human lives, great as this latter task is. It is the preservation and increase of God's own life in the lives of all mankind. If you believe this, you will wish to live sanely in a world that can yet be changed and brought back to Christ. Then you should earnestly and sincerely try to encourage at least one other person to enter the library field with a Christopher purpose, if you yourself cannot make it your lifetime career. And of course, we can also look at Christ as the term. Biblically, it's not one person. It's this anointing consciousness, so we can bring this anointed consciousness into our lives. But you can be tolerant, and you can realize that there are different degrees of good and truth. And some things, in some respects, aren't. It's not intolerant to admit that that's your conclusion.